Hello, greetings everyone. My name is Adam Marcus. I'm an Associate Professor of Architecture, California College of the Arts in San Francisco, and I'm a co-chair of this year's ACADIA conference. It's my pleasure to welcome so many people from across the world to the ACADIA 2020 Distributed Proximities Conference. Before we get started, we wanted to go over a few things related to our Zoom webinar format. This session is being recorded and will be available to registered conference attendees for viewing after the event through November 30th. Conference attendees will be able to access the recording afterwards using the same link you used to join this webinar, accessible via our conference website. This session is also being streamed live to the public on ACADIA's YouTube channel. In this Zoom webinar, only the moderator and presenters are able to participate and broadcast their video and audio. Webinar attendees are able to watch the session and contribute via chat and Q&A interfaces. Conference attendees are welcome to use the chat interface during the event, but we ask that all attendees remain respectful in your comments and observe ACADIA's Code of Conduct. If attendees have specific questions for the presenters, please use the Q&A function to ask your question. Questions in the Q&A will be processed, selected, and asked by the moderator. Thank you for your cooperation, and we hope that you enjoy the session. With that, I will now turn the camera over to ACADIA's president, Kathy Velikov. Kathy?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Kathy Velikov, and I am the president of ACADIA. I'm also an associate professor at the University of Michigan Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. It is my pleasure to welcome you to ACADIA's 40th annual conference, Distributed Proximities. As the title of the conference captures, although we cannot gather in person this year, I'm excited that we are able to come together online. I hope that you are staying safe and well, and I hope that you enjoy the next week of incredible presentations, discussions, and social events. The virtual format of this conference also has enabled us to do things that we could not have done in person. We have been able to welcome a much more global and diverse audience who in previous years may not have had the capacity to travel to the annual conference. We have opened the conference to over 1,500 global students, thanks to the generous support from Autodesk. And this year we were able to offer an unprecedented number of workshops that just ran this past weekend. We also introduced new submission categories such as videos and field notes. We could not have done all of this without the powerful financial support of our sponsors. Your generosity is particularly appreciated during this challenging period. We also could not have done this without the hard work from ACADIA's volunteer board of directors, and in particular, our amazing and tireless board-run conference co-chair team, Viola Ago, Matthias Del Campo, Shelby Doyle, Adam Marcus, Brian Slocum, and Maria Yablonina. They have given countless hours of their time to co-envision the conference, run the peer review process, and pretty much plan, organize, and manage everything that you will experience this week. I would also like to extend our thanks to the support of our new members, to our current members, and our longtime members, as well as our student members. As a non-for-profit, ACADIA depends on your support. This year's format has also allowed us to rethink the charge of ACADIA. ACADIA is a community of knowledge that is sustained through the active sharing and advancement of ideas and work around the rapidly changing and expanding role of computation in architecture, making, planning, building science, and design practice. As a community, we are continually changing and transforming. And this year, the conference organizers have taken the opportunity of our online conference to curate the keynote events as critical conversations around computation in contemporary design culture, with discussions around issues such as ecology, ethics, access, labor, and algorithmic biases. I am very excited to see the conversations at ACADIA expand to embrace these questions and consider them in relation to the incredible work and innovation produced by our community. And I will now turn the screen over to the conference co-organizers.
Hello, everyone. My name is Matias del Campo. I'm an associate professor of architecture at Topman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan and co-chair of ACADIA 2020. In addition, I serve as development officer of ACADIA. In this role, I would like to acknowledge the contribution of our sponsors. Without the generous support of our sponsors, it would not be possible to stage a conference like ACADIA. I would like to take a moment to recognize the contribution of our sponsors, especially considering the pressure of the current times. Our platinum sponsors Autodesk, Epic Games, and Zaha Hadid Architects. Silver sponsor Grimshaw Architects. Bronze sponsor HKS Line. And the sponsors Architect Machine and Oro Editions. As well as our technology sponsors for the workshops, Touch Designer, Hyper, Paperspace, Zaner, and Chaos Group, as well as our media partner, the Architects newspaper. This year, thanks to the generous sponsorship of Autodesk, we are pleased to offer free conference registration to all students globally. The Autodesk sponsorship has provided over 60 grants for members of NOMA, NOMAS, and the international students to attend the workshops at no cost. We are pleased that this year, registered architects are eligible to earn continuing education units for all sessions in the ACADIA conference for a nominal fee. A CU add-on can be purchased via the conference registration link through October 30th. Additional information can be found on the conference website.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Brian Slocum, one of this year's co-chairs, a full-time practitioner, and adjunct professor at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City, and current ACADIA secretary. When the board of directors began looking at alternatives to the in-person conference in March, a survey was circulated among the membership inquiring about the pandemic's effects on research. More than 65% of respondents reported disruptions of ongoing work, supporting a pivot to an alternative format that would address both distancing as well as its impacts to academics. But we also saw this reimagining as an opportunity. In every decision, we sought to foreground discourse on not just how we do what we do, but the why and the myriad consequences of our work. First, recognizing that as a community, we have always been distributed, the conference had to acknowledge that our present circumstance is quite unlike anything any of us has ever experienced, finding us not only apart from our ACADIA colleagues for this conference, where we usually gather every year, but having to work independently of our collaborators, our coworkers, and our students. In this state of forced semi-autonomy, adaptations have spontaneously emerged, demonstrating the resilience and ingenuity of our computational design community in the face of the crisis. And ironically, and surprisingly, this year's conference permits closer virtual proximity, as evidenced by the fact that this conference already has a larger and more diverse attendance and roster of speakers than any ACADIA conference ever. In the absence of spatial proximity, this forum is intended to highlight other important and perhaps even latent proximities, in addition to providing space for new lines of inquiry and dialogue. We're really happy to have you all here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Jablonina, and I'm an assistant professor and also a co-chair of this conference. And my position currently is at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design at the University of Toronto. In addition to being extremely excited to welcome you in the Zoom webinar and the YouTube streaming environment, we are very proud to announce the custom conference platform that was developed by Oliver Popovich in collaboration with this year's ACADIA co-chair team. The platform allows the participants to explore conference content and events in a space generated by a machine learning algorithm that was trained on the approximately 13,000 submissions from the ACADIA database of previous year's conferences. The content is organized in a digital 3D space by cross-referencing thematic relationships discovered by the algorithm and visualizing connections in 3 dimensions. The intention here is to encourage and promote serendipitous intellectual encounters that might normally occur at an in-person conference. The conference platform serves as the exhibition site for projects, papers, field notes, and videos. A quick note on navigation: if you're looking for a specific author, paper, or project, please use the search box in the top left. You can also, from the platform, you can also open the conference menu where you can join a live event and or register for the conference. Please note that the registration will be open until the last day of the conference. If you miss an event, the recorded videos will be available for all conference attendees to watch throughout November 30th. Moreover, we are very proud to introduce a special release of the Murmur video platform that was originally developed by Alton Byrne and customized for Acadia by Oliver Popovich. Murmur will serve as an informal meeting space during our coffee break and happy hours. Both Oliver and Alton will be presenting a more detailed description of each of the two platforms later today during the exhibition opening, which will begin at 4:15 EDT. Additionally, during the exhibition opening that we invite all of you to participate in, we will be hearing from a curated group of project authors during the Pechakucha project event and discussion.
Hi, my name is Shelby Doyle, and I'm an assistant professor of architecture at Iowa State University and a co-chair of this year's conference. This past weekend, ACADIA 2020 kicked off with a series of 14 workshops. The online format made it possible to offer more workshops than during a typical ACADIA conference. And it allowed us to bring together an incredible group of workshop leaders, researchers, practitioners, innovators, and artists from multiple countries and regions. A combination of invited and selected topics were identified with the goal of leveraging long-distance collaborations, remote fabrication, and innovative software. And here's a quick sample of the variety and quantity of work explored during these two-day workshops. We hope that you join us during the workshop showcase on Thursday at 6 p.m. EDT to see the results of all of the work that was done.
Hi, I'm Viola Ago, and I'm one of the co-chairs for this year's conference. I'm currently the Worthen Fellow at the Rice University School of Architecture, and I run a design research practice called Miracles. This year, we've organized the accepted peer-reviewed paper abstracts into 14 sessions that will be chaired by this incredible group of researchers and designers. We had a record submission of abstracts this past summer, our second highest in Acadia's history. This year's acceptance rate was incredibly competitive at just under 28%. As my colleagues mentioned, we've attempted to respond to urgent issues and questions in our field as we attempt to negotiate known tropes and familiar projects with new thinking and technologies. During the peer review process, we attempted to construct a diverse cohort of reviewers in order to productively expand the conversation to timely topics that undergird the technological world in architecture and design. We're thrilled and honored to host an incredible group of authors whose work has exhibited the highest standards of scholarship and research. The full papers will be completed after the conference. The hard copy publication will be available for purchase, and the digital version will be available to all conference attendees at no cost. We are all greatly looking forward to the conversations to follow.
In addition to the paper presentations, this week will also include 5 events celebrating the 2020 Acadia Award winners. This is an annual awards program administered by Acadia's Board of Directors, which recognizes cutting-edge work in digital design, research, practice, and pedagogy. We have also organized a number of special sessions throughout the week, some of which have already been mentioned by my co-chairs. I'd like to point out a few in particular. Tomorrow evening will be a panel on architects and personal protective equipment production, focusing on the significant role that members of this community have played in responding to the pandemic. Wednesday will be a Pechakucha presentation and discussion with authors of our field note submissions, presenting behind the scenes and in-process work. And Friday will be our annual general meeting, where all Acadia members are invited to learn about the organization and our sibling organizations, celebrate the conference grant recipients, meet the new leadership and incoming president, and hear about our upcoming plans. If you paid to register for this conference, that means that you are now a voting Acadia member, and we encourage you to come on Friday. And finally, last but not least, the conference features an incredible lineup of 6 keynote events. Rather than the conventional singular keynote lecture, we have structured these events as conversations between multiple people, with the intention of promoting critical discourse around a set of specific topics. we've tried to expand the scope of the conversation that one might typically encounter at a conference like ACADIA, with event themes such as data and bias, automation and agency, culture and access, labor and practice, and a closing roundtable on speculation and critique. Please check the website for details on the full list of keynotes and the incredible speakers who will present this week. And we are here now for the first of these keynotes, an event that I am extremely honored to introduce. As my co-chair Brian alluded to in his earlier introduction of the conference theme, we are at an inflection point in our relationship with design technology. For 40 years now, the ACADIA community has operated at the vanguard of figuring out how we can use computation to design, analyze, simulate, fabricate, and assemble new kinds of architectures. And yet, at this moment, the mere demonstration of technical virtuosity feels insufficient, as we now have the ability, and indeed the obligation, to more critically engage questions not only of how technology works, but why we might implement it to address the significant challenges of our time. Of course, the most existential of these challenges is the planet's escalating climate crisis and its exacerbation of social, political, and economic disparities worldwide. It is with this context in mind that we framed this first keynote conversation as an opportunity to confront computation's engagement with broader ecological processes. I can't think of two more appropriate figures to help us navigate through these entangled questions of technology, ecology, and ethics than today's presenters. Our first speaker, Jennifer Gabrys, is chair in Media, Culture, and Environment in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge and visiting professor in the Department of Sociology at Goldsmiths, University of London. She is principal investigator on the project AirKit, and she leads the Citizen Sense project, which I believe she will be speaking about today. Dr. Gabrys' work focuses on what she calls the quote, the becoming environmental of computation, a powerful concept explored in her terrific 2016 book, Program Earth, Environmental Sensing Technology and the Making of a Computational Planet. Her work offers a critical yet ultimately optimistic vision for how technology might enable a more democratic and participatory ethos of ecological awareness. Our second speaker and respondent, Molly Wright Steenson, is Senior Associate Dean for Research in the College of Fine Arts at Carnegie Mellon University, where she is also the K&L Gates Associate Professor of Ethics and Computational Technologies and Associate Professor in the School of Design. Dr. Steenson's book, Architectural Intelligence, How Designers and Architects Created the Digital Landscape, which should be required reading for all architecture students, offers a detailed history of architecture's long and wide-ranging engagement with computational thinking. Her work broadly explores the relationship between AI and human society and how algorithms and computation condition the world we live in. The format for today's event will be first a presentation by Professor Gabrys, then a response by Professor Steenson, followed by a conversation and Q&A if time permits. With that, it's my great pleasure to turn the camera over to Jennifer. Professor Gabrys, welcome to ACADIA.
Thank you, Adam, for that incredibly generous introduction. And thank you also to the organizers for asking me to present in this amazing event. It's really incredible to see this range of presentations and the websites. And I'm also delighted to be in conversation with Molly as part of the keynote discussion today. So I'm just going to share my screen here. And as Adam mentioned, I will be speaking today about how to sense a planet in crisis, but really looking at this question from the perspective of citizen sensing. So rather than looking at this as a remote sensing problem, something undertaken by technocrats, I'm really going to be looking at how practitioners as well as citizens engage in citizen sensing projects. So the image that I'm showing you here from this map is an example of a citizen sensing technology, Purple Air, which is showing wildfire pollution from the 2018 wildfires, in fact, in California, when California had some of the highest air pollution levels in the world. So here, citizen sensors were capturing events that, in fact, regulatory monitors were not even in place to capture. So what's quite interesting about this is not only the ways in which environmental change is flashing up and becoming evident, but how citizen sensors are really the devices and the practices that are capturing these events. So I want to think about this in the context of a recent manual of sorts that I've written called How to Do Things with Sensors, and you can find this online as well as in print format through the University of Minnesota Press. But in this text, I work through a number of how-to components of how to do things with sensors. So I want to follow the format of this how-to guide in quite an abbreviated form to ask how it's possible to generate ecological, ethical, and socio-political practices for sensing a planet in crisis. And as Adam mentioned, I will especially draw on examples from the Citizen Sense Project, a research and practice initiative that I've been leading for over 8 years now, which has looked at how people use sensors, especially to monitor air quality. So part one, how to do things with sensors. The world of sensors is one of amplified connections. Sensors, I'm sure as many practitioners here know, are meant to join up and speed up while also facilitating enabling. Sensors can be found in urban infrastructure and surveillance systems, and they're also packaged in makerly kits and citizen sensing projects for monitoring environmental pollution. But to get here, you need to follow the instructions. Working with sensors in a citizenly mode typically requires the uptake of the how-to guide. Citizen sensing requires settling into the instructional mode and the imperative mood. Here, a sensing citizen is a handy subject, an action-oriented and technically equipped actor who's meant to tinker toward new technical and ecological configurations. So here I want to look at how sensors and the growing use of these devices for citizen sensing projects are in some ways a part of a wider movement of the do-it-yourself and the how-to. And you'll find many handbooks and forums and YouTube videos for how to assemble different Internet of Things devices and instructables. While the how-to guide is now prevalent within digital spaces, it's also not unique to the realm of the digital. And you can find titles and handbooks that advise how to live forever, how to meet aliens, how to conquer the internet, and how to save the planet. How-to guides run into the tens of thousands of volumes. They provide instructions for organizing political campaigns, for undertaking direct action, and for following steps toward greater democratization, as well as for surviving in a world with which one is at odds. Of course, the digital realm is full of these how-to guides for instance, how to scrape geospatial data and a number of other toolkits. So in thinking about how to do things with sensors, I'm really approaching the different ways in which digital and environmental citizens enter into these processes and what practices they undertake as they attempt to make and use these technologies. Of course, people are entering into modes of procedure and instruction, implementation, and instrumentality, but these are also techniques that potentially guide people toward participation and more ecological and ethical practices. So the how to do things with sensors guide is written as a response. On the one hand, many people have asked me, would I write a guide for how to undertake citizen sensing so people could learn how to monitor air quality? So it is a handbook of sorts, although it isn't quite a step-by-step guide, but it does recount experiences of initially testing sensors for environmental monitoring and then deploying these in the field, which I'll discuss today. At the same time, though, I want to think about the how-to as a genre and approach and ask, why is this mode seemingly most effective for engaging with technology and for addressing environmental problems? What are the opportunities of the how-to approach? What are its fizzy promises? And also, what are its unseen pitfalls? So I want to work through the how-to from the perspective of practice rather than standing from the outside and looking at this as a discourse analysis. I'll describe how we actually took up sensors, tried to get them to work, tried to make sense of the data, and even to realize political and ecological change. So in this way, I consider how the how-to is not only enabling technical engagements, but it's also offering distinct ways of engaging with ecological and ethical problems. So these toolkits offer ways to make not just digital sensors, but also to construct social political worlds. Part 2, how to construct toolkits. Many digital technologies occupy a curiously contrary position. On the one hand, they seem to offer engagement and empowerment for individual users. On the other hand, they are often highly controlled and monopolized technologies that bind users into particular practices and relations. In order to unravel the typically rigid contours of digital devices, many technology advocates have begun to assemble microcontrollers, sensors, and code to develop a more informed engagement with these machines. So the toolkit actually becomes a way to fashion a more deliberate encounter with digital devices. Citizen sensing technologies are examples of these approaches that encounter how-to instructions by attempting to make devices and also to build more livable worlds. These digital technologies are used to measure and monitor environmental problems and to generate data that could be actionable for policy and regulation. Many of these technologies monitor environmental variables such as air or noise. And with these monitoring practices, there are also instructions for how to undertake campaigns, how to install devices, and how to analyze data. So you'll find that these toolkits assemble not just as technical configurations, but also as ways of undertaking community organizing and local activism for guiding urban design and traffic interventions, as well as undertaking collective mappings and town hall meetings. So these aspects of toolkits are no less important, yet they often recede from view when the focus is on learning the technical aspects of digital monitoring technologies. And here's where the citizen sensing technologies could really be seen to be instrumental. And this is a term I'll work with throughout this presentation to think about what the instrumental means. Is the instrumental a reductive and functional approach to devices and also citizenship and political engagement? Or could it be possible to rework instruments and instrumentalities by taking up instruments in a different register, by trying to expand our vocabularies of effect and effectiveness, and to challenge the apparently linear logic of these instruments by engaging in more wayward operations of attempting to realize ecological and political change? So let's look more closely at a few citizen sensing technologies to consider how these practices present alternative strategies for documenting and acting on environmental problems. The focus will be on primarily here on citizen sensing through air quality, yet there are many more sensors for monitoring water, noise, vibration, temperature, humidity, wind, heat, energy, radiation, soil, and vegetation. One of the earliest and most long-standing uses of DIY sensors has been to monitor air quality. And the problem of air quality, we could say, is organized in a way that environmental sensors make possible by collecting data, by communicating evidence, and by making pollution visible in particular ways. So in the space of air pollution sensors, there is really a sprawling list of devices that are, some of which are operational, some of which are obsolete, some of which are speculative, some of which are in prototype stage. And you can see an incomplete list here of everything from breezy to pufftrones and the dust box and more conventional devices as well. So these are off-the-shelf kits. They're DIY devices. They come as wearables and desktop devices as well as apps. The assortment of names suggests everything from democratic initiatives to manga characters. In this incomplete list, you'll find that some devices require assembly and others are locked down as consumer products. It could be easy enough to buy a device to plug in and begin to generate data, but this also begins to raise questions about the sort of data that you might be generating, whether devices are calibrated, and how to access data and make sense of it, and to even make claims about environmental pollution. So let's turn now to look at some examples of what's involved in assembling sensors for testing and use, and ask a few questions along the way, including how does an environmental monitoring toolkit expand or shapeshift along with differing uses? What other considerations come to the fore when attempting to monitor air pollution near an industry site or in a congested city? And how does the how-to necessarily expand from technical delineations to indicate how these practices have been political all along? Part 3, how to connect sensors. The process of working with sensors includes struggles with upgrades and fixes, wonderings at outputs and platforms, and trials to test sensors in situ and to compare readings to regulatory monitors. Through many practical tests of citizen sensing technologies, we found that as users of these sensors, we also became enrolled in contributing to their ongoing development by getting them to function and by contributing to online communities, providing mutual instructions and tips for troubleshooting. By getting devices to function, though, I'm also referring not just to making photoresistors blink and microcontrollers talk, but also to the extended socio-political and environmental relations that need to take hold for these devices to have effect, from communities organizing to address pollution, to participatory research that works toward collaborative practices of inquiry, which also makes sensors operational. So one device that is quite a kind of interesting early example of attempting to get air quality sensors to work is the air quality egg. So this was a device that could be purchased, one of the earliest devices that could be purchased as a complete product. And it seemed to offer a rather effortless way in which to plug in a device, generate air pollution data, and begin to undertake practices of public engagement. Yet when we received this device, it often also presented us with a number of puzzles about how to work with it, including its promise that by plugging in the device, the problem of air pollution would be solved. It says, do you ever think about the air you breathe? It affects us in ways we can see and in ways we can't. So here the air quality egg is meant to make the problem of air pollution visible and to connect you to a global community of concerned citizens. Yet this is a kind of strangely daunting prospect that you'd be able to plug in a sensor and be instantly connected to a global community who could solve the problem of air pollution. So we really had to put this to the test to see how this might work. Once we had unpackaged the air quality egg and scanned its different components, we read through what were seemingly quite straightforward instructions and put the air quality egg on its Google Map platform and saw at the time it was part of a community of around 250 eggs. So then we turned to the problem of attempting to post data. Yet in the process, we found that the egg required an update, and we were quickly having to work through a number of forums, FAQ instructions, having to fork a repository of code from GitHub, and reprogram the Arduino microcontroller on the egg. So after a rather lengthy process of reprogramming the egg, it still was not producing data in a way that really made sense in comparison to regulatory monitors. We were having readings of nitrogen dioxide and carbon monoxide, but not in units that made sense, and so the data here remained relatively inexplicable. So here, the universal citizen sensor, who is meant to be embedded in a community of global citizens, comes down to earth by having to work through the specificities of particular infrastructural configurations, where the seamless plug-and-play logic breaks down into a set of obstacles and more complex malfunctions. So here we also found that we had to work through the logics of this instrument to begin to think about how to put it to work and also potentially rework its instrumentality toward other more open engagements. So you might find that when you take an off-the-shelf sensor that promises you can simply connect to a larger community of fellow citizens, that these devices do not work in such a straightforward fashion. Instead, citizen sensors can generate more open-air instrumentalisms through the process of initially following instructions, but then setting these toolkits and technologies to work in the world, and that their malfunctions might actually be the beginning of realizing other ecological and ethical worlds and subjects in the making. Part 4, how to devise instruments. But this is not to say that devices do not ever arrive at a condition of organized use or implementation. Instead, it is to signal how setting up citizen sensing technologies is an ongoing trial, a back and forth effort of testing and tweaking. At the same time, despite the democratic selling points, many devices remain tied to practices primarily focused on technology and making, and so can become somewhat self-referential in their pursuits, thereby missing the promise to address environmental problems. Yet if, as John Dewey has suggested, the invention of new agencies and instruments creates new ends, then how do these instruments create new consequences and stir us to form new purposes? Instruments do work in the world. They can make undetectable phenomena evident. They can tune us into registers of experience, and they attach us to perceptive practices that remake our sensory and political worlds. These qualities of instruments, I suggest, are a critical part of how to think about how to do things with sensors to realize more just and livable ecological and ethical worlds. Part 5, how to build networks. The modes of action mobilized through citizen sensing technologies include making and coding, monitoring and data collection, and these are expressed with and through instruments. The command is often to get practical or enough discussion, it's time to build. And these are actions that are often bundled into instructional toolkits. Yet these instrumental imperatives take on a much different register when instruments are set to work in the world, where getting practical can really shift the current operating conditions. And here's where we could draw on another sense of the practical from the philosopher William James, who suggests that the practical is the distinctively concrete, the individual, the particular, and effective, as opposed to the abstract, general, and inert. Here for James, the distinctively concrete also refers not only to things, but also to relations. Or as Donna Haraway has suggested in her discussion of another instrument, the air pump, nothing comes without its world. So you might find that by getting practical, this will require a greater engagement with the sprawling relations, networks, and worlds, as well as ecologies and ethics that instruments inform. So constructing toolkits and connecting sensors are practices that expand into techniques for building networks. Getting practical also involves building these ecological and ethical relations. When plugging in a sensor, this is not just about piping data to a platform, it's also about creating communities of different relations who might address environmental pollution. So sensors here become part of a practice of community organizing that can transform through the use of sensors. At the same time, sensors are and networks are already at work in the world. So the Citizen Sense project, and here I'll work through a particular example of how we put sensors to work in Pennsylvania, in northeastern Pennsylvania, where we worked with communities to sense air pollution from fracking infrastructure. So here we first set about doing this work by working with the communities to learn about their existing monitoring practices. Many people were concerned about pollution from fracking, and they had monitored water, and they were also interested to monitor air pollution, which is a relatively new area for them to study. So as we were learning about their practices, we undertook online searches, we attended community meetings in person and through teleconferences, we held interviews and made site visits in the Endless Mountains, we hosted community mapping workshops, and we undertook monitoring walks. And we found that people were using a whole range of different devices to monitor air, water, noise, and traffic, including analog and digital sensors. They were using particulate matter sensors, air pollution badges, decibel meters, FLIR infrared cameras, as you can see here, video and photography, and CCTV installations. Communities were using professional lab testing services, environmental justice devices such as the Bucket Brigade for sampling air. They were gathering and consulting planning documents. They were keeping track of changing land surveys, and they were monitoring policy and regulation, as well as petitioning for changes and improvements to environmental controls. So in the course of organizing to address environmental pollution, the identification of pollution sources and tools to monitor emissions becomes just one part of different aspects of undertaking environmental sensing. Communities here were working within existing networks. They were organizing environmental projects. And this is the way in which we came into dialogue with them to think about how they might use a different kind of expanded real-time digital sensor network that we built in conversation with them. But at the same time, communities were contacting regulators, they were registering complaints about pollution, they were hosting their own meetings, they were gathering evidence about health conditions, they were giving public testimony, sharing news on social media, and contacting experts and public figures to expand and amplify their networks. So here, instrumentalities shift, where to build something involves much more than making a digital device operational. A project to monitor and address air pollution involves building community networks as ongoing, iterative, contingent practices that are ways of making and maintaining ecological, ethical, technical, and social infrastructures. In this respect, participation involves much more than merely using a sensor to gather a measurement. Instead, another approach to the how-to emerges here, which asks, how it might be possible to organize different ways of life. How indicates procedure, practice, and process, where the imperative mood shifts to become less a set of instructions, commanding, and instead a certain obligation and necessity. So the imperative here is about something that is urgent, a responsibility, and a commitment to justice. So here we could also think about how the how-to opens up different ways of remaking worlds. And here, drawing on Indigenous theorist and writer Leanne Betesomasake Simpson, writes in relation to Anishinaabeg thought and practice, it becomes clear to me that how we live, how we organize, how we engage in the world, the process, not only frames the outcome, it is the transformation. How molds and then gives birth to the present. The how changes us. How is the theoretical invention. How is the world-making process that traverses ways of life, modes of politics, registers of experience, and integrities of relation. It informs subjects and environments. It is both a theoretical intervention and an embodied collective practice. So here we potentially move away from making as a good in and of itself, where action is simply about getting practical in a hands-on way. And these are usually proposed as remedies for how to address problems. Indeed, as Lily Irani has observed when describing a hackathon, there was a notable bias for action, where participants sought to intervene in the operations of the world through action and making. Yet such emphasis on making and action can seem to constitute a makerly subject who undertakes activities because they seem productive. Yet as the pragmatists such as William James have suggested and critiqued, action for action's sake is a somewhat empty project, but practice is essential notwithstanding, because this is the space in which ideas are put to work. It is this very operationalization of ideas, the instrumental aspects of instruments, that are important to realize the effects of ideas. So doing unfolds ways of being in and being for worlds. Doing can reproduce structures of inequality if not undertaken in a thoughtful way. But it can also test, transform, and generate different relations. So this is the way in which I'm proposing we could rethink instruments and instrumentalities not as linear trajectories towards certain outcomes, but rather as contingent operations that remake worlds. Part 6, how to test resistance. While once presenting citizen sense research, I was asked by a participant whether the work was somewhat risky, since it would be perceived to be an activist project. Indeed, the questioner considered whether the topic of fracking was controversial, and the perception that the research could be seen to be helping people might forego the objectivity that is meant to characterize academic research. And I've received variants of this question in other events. But here I would cue Donna Haraway's Modest Witness, which is a figure she mobilizes to show how the very perception that inquiry involves standing back and letting events take their course, whether in the form of instruments or socio and ecological affairs, is a privileged way of organizing inquiry that allows some people and actions to recede from view to generate the perception of universality, while others are branded as illegitimate since their presence jams the signal of objectivity. Observing is acting, rather than assume the position of non-engagement to achieve objectivity. We could say that engagement is a way to pursue the promises of this different type of instrumentality. So you might find when taking sensors into the open air, working to build community monitoring networks and grappling with environmental problems, that resistance takes on an electro-political oscillation. Communities are diversely engaged in struggles, and sensors enter into the fray as part of the process of inquiry and evidence making. And here's where struggle is an essential part of how these projects and practices unfold. Resistance is encountered here not just as a lesson in voltage, but also as a response to citizen data, where experts and governments and regulators in industry often query the data that citizens generate. Resistance also can come in the form of attempting to circumvent the usual way in which environmental problems are addressed by gathering and presenting different kinds of evidence. So it's important here to think about how citizen sensing technologies are not simply forms of activity that can be dismissed through the label of activism, but instead that this is a way of engaging with transformed political engagements, not simply by plugging in a device, and also not simply by empowering people. So when working with communities in a participatory way, it's possible to learn about the multiple approaches to addressing environmental pollution, the friction and the discord, the multiple strategies for organizing, and environmental encroachments that might be held at bay. So here, searching for instructions, this kind of how-to approach is often just the beginning of a vector of transformation, and also the beginning of also testing resistance that people will encounter along the way. So the final section, how to retool toolkits. I'm frequently asked whether citizen sense research is empowering people and communities. And the short answer is not as directly as that. The medium answer is we should always query the easy connection between technology and empowerment. And the long answer is it might be advisable to rethink this how-to exploration, which seeks to trouble and rework the ways in which toolkits and empowerment are constituted. Or as Isabel Stengers has suggested, it might also be possible to consider how a situation enables people to be empowered, where it gives people the force and the power to think and invent. So this how-to guide explains how it might be possible to inhabit, yet also to transform the ways in which these technologies operate, to work in a practice-based register, to follow their instrumental logics, but also to break with these instrumental trajectories. These are retooling practices that retool toolkits. And this is a way of also engaging with the struggle that these devices will throw up when they are put to work in the world. It's to act ask how toolkits are configured and operationalized, and also how they might give rise to different flex points for transformation. So the point of interrogating instrumentality in this way has been to consider how citizen sensing technologies could be described as instrumental in the limited sense, as merely functional. And this could also give rise to a functional form of politics. But there are other ways of thinking about instruments and instrumentalities that become prospective. These are kinds of open air instrumentalisms that generate new political inhabitations. This is where how to do things is to ask how to transform things. It is to inquire how to experience and influence worlds. Instruments and instrumentalities do not offer up guaranteed ends, but rather unfold operations that are ways of engaging with ideas, technologies, relations, ecologies, and ethics. So here's what you might have learned in the process of following these instructions, this 7-part guide. How to is not a rule, but a proposition. Its imperative mood is one of urgency and even obligation, more than a command. How to enables modes of inquiry, action, and conduct. How to is also experimental in its searching after ways to address problems. How to is a project that activates operations to make and remake more ecological, ethical, just, and democratic worlds. This is, of course, just the beginning of a set of how-to lists that you could generate yourself. And you could put these considerations to work in any number of how-to practices, including how to monitor pollution over time, how to analyze data, how to influence policy, how to remake environmental relations, and how to build more just worlds. I'd like to thank everyone who contributed to this project, especially the residents of Southeast London, as you saw at the end, and Northeast Pennsylvania, as you saw in the middle section of the talk, and the number of researchers and also consultants and designers who we worked with as part of this project, and of course the European Research Council who made the work possible. And if you're interested to follow up and look at our work further, you can go to our website at citizensense.net. And now I look forward very much to conversation with Molly, who I think will raise even further considerations of ecology and ethics.
And as usual, I'm not on mic. Hi, Jennifer. Thank you so much for the fabulous talk, and hello to everybody at Acadia. It is a pleasure to be here. I only wish we could be in the same place, but I'm glad that this distribution gives us a new kind of experience to work globally and see more of you. I have a brief response to Jennifer's talk. I'm going to pull up some slides and then we're going to have a conversation. I'd also like to invite you to ask questions in the Q&A part of the tray down below. So you can put your questions there and we will get to them if we can. Thank you. Oops, sorry, one error. Great. At the beginning of Jennifer Gabrys' book, Program Earth, she talks about the emergence of Sputnik. And she writes that, as it turns out, sensing has come down to Earth since the time of Sputnik. And that environmental monitoring, she writes, is a practice that is computational, often networked, frequently automated, and increasingly ubiquitous, which is something that she's situating in a broad set of monitoring practices and sensing practices from the radio signals of Sputnik to Mark Weiser's ubiquitous computing and beyond. In Program Earth, she writes, read through devices such as sensors and satellites and assembled into networks and code, ecology is now a shifting entity that typically becomes visible and manageable as information. In this way, such ecologies inform our lived material, political, and ethical engagements, and they contribute to the scope of our environmental practices. And I want to look at this idea here of ecologies and inform, because informing is something that Jennifer Gabrys has thought quite a bit about what it means to experience the forming and formation of something. I find myself thinking about information, and at that, as the media theorist and legal scholar Cornelia Visman puts it, in format, in, which is to say that the information and the form and the format are all contained within each other. Jennifer Gabrys talks about this as a question of becoming environmental, which she calls a distributed and embedded range of monitoring technologies. She also says that this is distributed and embedded range of monitoring technologies that inform how environments are sensed and managed. And moving back and forth between the sensing and the environment, we start to see something new emerge. And within her work, as we've just seen through the how-to guide and throughout many of her other projects and texts, we see not only the possibilities of sensors, but the possibility of sensing. And at that, a new way of seeing the possibilities of experience. The title of our session today is Ecology and Ethics, an opening conversation. And at that, I think it's important for us to consider the possibilities of ethics. What exactly do we mean by ethics? We know that 2019 was the big boom year for ethics in just about everything. And we find that traditional definitions of ethics center on moral principles. If I look at the Oxford English Dictionary, I see things like this, that ethics are specifically a system of moral principles. And typically, if we look at morals, we see good, bad, right, wrong, good, evil, that these are about human characteristics and related to actions, desires, and human character. So these two definitions of ethics and morals seem to be, I don't know, potentially limited. And I think we see the opportunities for opening these up a bit more, both in the current moment in technology and through Jennifer Gabrys' work. Where does the moral fit into ethics frameworks for computation? And is ethics actually really what we're talking about? I'm in the midst of a study with a group of faculty and students at Carnegie Mellon in looking at how discussions about AI and ethics are taken up. And there are some 210 different AI and ethics frameworks, toolkits, principles, codes of conduct, checklists, oaths, and manifestos across the board. In fact, this number is from earlier this year. There are probably more now. And you see them sometimes pared down. This particular version is an AI and ethics framework that, that the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard has been putting together. You can find this online. It's probably a little bit too much for you to get into right now, but you can see different themes and different areas of inquiry that questions of ethics and technology find themselves in. There's also a move afoot to pare down those lists of ethics frameworks. And rather surprisingly, we find that the Department of Defense has actually done a pretty good job of coming up with ethical principles for artificial intelligence, boiling them down to being responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable. In the study we've been doing, one of the things we've done is to look at medium.com, and we've scraped discourse on artificial intelligence, ethics, design, governance, regulation, machine learning, robotics, algorithms, design, and big data, among others. We're also doing this study across major publications like the New York Times, Washington Post, and across academic journals. And what we're discovering is that when we start talking about ethics and technology, maybe not surprisingly, the figure of the human designer and technologist become part of the conversation, which is to say that if you leave ethics completely out of a conversation about machine learning, you're going to find a lot of talk about algorithms. But if you start bringing in ethics, one of the first things that's going to come up is the word technologist, as well as human, AI, and bias. So if ethics in computation highlights the role of the human, then Jennifer Gabrys' work in How to Do Things with Sensors expands the territory of that conversation. How to do things with sensors and this idea of how to, she writes, becomes an invitation to make, organize, orchestrate, conjure, and sustain people, technology, and worlds toward openings rather than prescribed ends. In this amalgamation or assemblage of sensing the environment, sensors and experience, how to, relations, and informing, I'd like to know what kind of ethics we might find. And conversely, I'd like to know what ethics might find in this approach. So not just good, bad, right, wrong, good, evil, and the way we've been looking at morality tied to human character and morality tied to ethics, but rather a new view of the citizen who possesses rights, privileges, and responsibilities. So within the sensing the environment, relations, and informing, perhaps we see how to as an ethics in the environment, both beyond the human and the more than human. Jennifer Gabrys quoted Leanne Betasamosake Simpson's piece, as we've always done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance. And I find myself continually coming back to this quote, in which she says, it became clear to me that how we live, how we organize, how we engage in the world, the process not only frames the outcome, it is the transformation. That's the first part of that quote. So the question then is how, and the question is how to, and the question is how to remake worlds. So let's move from there on to our conversation. Hi, Jennifer. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. That was a really fantastic way to open up the conversation. And I think this point you raise about AI and ethics is really interesting in terms of the sorts of ethics that are mobilized in these 210 and counting examples of how ethics is captured and the way in which the ethical becomes the how-to. So thanks for that. I think that's really provocative to think of that as the how-to guide. Have you thought about it in that way? As
very much.
Yeah.
And I just want to say that I appreciate your work being a new lens onto this, because I think it greatly expands the way that we talk about AI. On one hand, I could quote Ruman Chowdhury, who is an AI strategist at Accenture, and she points out that AI is really just another word for computation or computers these days. But on the other hand, I think we have expectations that it's something greater. And what I appreciate about an overlay of your work onto this question of ethics and computation is that we start to think about this in terms of ecology, environment, and citizenship. And as you concluded in Remaking Worlds. But yeah, one of the things that I've been observing is the way that on one hand, ethics frameworks are being developed by companies, by nonprofits, and then at the level of companies, such as Facebook or Microsoft, they become known as responsible innovation and no longer ethics. And when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, technologists need to be implementing, operationalizing, and optimizing their code, as though they've left out a whole area of design, right? Of design, observation, of engagement, of making, of the world where architects and designers find themselves. And I wonder if you have some thought about the role of design within this broader process of sensing, engaging, and remaking.
Yes, I think that's a great question, because we very much worked in a practice-based way. I would say this is informed by my prior life as working in landscape architecture and working also as a designer, and bringing these kind of practice-based modes of inquiry to understand how technologies work in the world. So it's not just designing an object, so it looks and functions in a particular way, but it's also from a more, I guess, sociological perspective, seeing how people take up devices, put them to work, use them to generate data, make claims, and go to their regulators, phone up their regulators and make complaints, and then end up in also different kinds of engagements, from productive meetings to altercations when they have this pollution data. So I think this is the point, to come back to the AI and ethics and other forms of technology and ethics, that is, I think, really necessary to look at. And I think that this is where design can really step into the breach, is how do these technologies really start to unfold in the world? How can we understand this through different processes of collaborative design and research, and see ethics not as something that is completed at the point that a technology is sort of stamped out from a manufacturing space, but is something that is ongoing, will have to continually be revisited, and has to also include people as part of those processes, so that these don't end up becoming, as we're seeing now, de-democratizing devices. So this is where I think, because designers do have so much experience working in practice-based ways, working collaborative, participatory ways, putting things to work in the world, and tweaking and iterating, and not just seeing it as a one-stop process, that we can really think about bringing this into a kind of understanding of ethics potentially as well, among many other things.
So I thought to ask you how you might describe what ethics is. And I think that two things that you've just suggested are that ethics are not a destination, but an ongoing process. I don't know if journey is the right word. I wonder if you might suggest, well, why don't I, rather than asking you what I think it might be, how would you describe ethics? How would you define it from your perspective and from your work?
Well, I'm not really one for definitions. I should say this is part of what the how-to guide really troubles. If we think about the definition as an initial instruction, and this is the way the pragmatists would approach this. So their kind of baseline was, rather than have to kind of nail down once and for all what these grand concepts are, like truth or ethics, and then also end up asking yourself, how do we even know what we know, and begin to dismantle the subject along the way. How is it possible instead to have provisional concepts that can then be put to work in the world, and to continually remake those concepts by seeing what effects they have, and by tuning them through these different experiments? So this is a different way of approaching concepts, a concept like ethics, rather than saying that I have the definitive kind of answer for what ethics is or ought to be. And this is where perhaps moralism has that promise that it will be able to encompass once and for all time what that consists of. It's a kind of germination of a process for how to engage, how to approach situations, and how to continually remake them. And I would say that is, if there's any definition of ethics, it's that. It's being able to enter into these contingent engagements and to have the processes by which it's possible to form collectives, to address problems, and to realize more just worlds that are less destructive, less unequal, and so on. So this is where I think also any approach that would say, well, we have our foundational script, that's all we ever need. And I think we're seeing this in many arenas of political life these days. In fact, that is not good enough, because it is the very life interpretation, process, and engagement that makes that initial germ of a concept what it is in the world, whether we're talking about technology, environmental problems, or anything else that's currently troubling democracy.
I'm struck that you've laid out a process that is approach, engage, remake, or approach, engage, remake, kind of as a broader set of cycles. And I'm very much struck by this notion of the practical, the heuristic, the learning at hand, and something you write about across your work. This notion of tuning and what it is to get something in tune so that it might sense, and so that the person, the entity, the relationships might better sense as well.
Yes, I mean, I think this is a concept that I'm really interested in, and I've taken it up and reworked it from an initial. It's actually Isabel Stengers was citing Alan Pickering's discussion of laboratory instruments and getting them to work and tuning all these laboratory instruments. And then I take this up and think about it as the way in which sensors are now working in the world, and how this is not just one human sensing subject saying, oh, I see or hear this thing, but rather it's about environments of sensation. It's about all sorts of different entities sensing together, and that this tuning process then is a way to also think about environmental engagements and ethics. So we could think about this in relation to climate change, for example, and how many different organisms are changing because of climate change. Plants are flowering out at different times. Birds are migrating at different times. So we can begin to see them as sensors who are tracking changes in environments, and begin to understand the changing environments that we're all involved in, and also in a way responsible for the ways that we'll have to respond to these changing environments. So this is a kind of tuning, to shared, differently shared, but collective conditions, and a kind of way to think about practice in this iterative way, as you've mentioned, where it's not a kind of single trajectory toward a certain outcome, but rather is an ethos of how to engage and work with all of these different actors and conditions to have potentially less destructive environments.
It's interesting also to take your work in Program Earth and then think through the How To book as well. And you've just talked about this notion of modest witness and resistance and logging, right? Logbooks and different ways of collecting knowledge that might on the surface seem to be passive, but are actually anything but. And I'm reminded of the ways that sensors do in fact work. They collect, they channel, they are informing, and informing in all of the ways that means. And so it becomes something where this notion of experience, I think, is activated, perhaps would be the best way to put that, in this notion of making worlds.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, here's where I think sensing is anything but a passive process, as you've mentioned. And if we think about the work that sensors do, they tune our attention to some things and not others. They create a measurement of particulate matter, for instance, but they're not necessarily telling you about somebody's asthma or about the fact that 1 in 9 people worldwide die from air pollution related causes. So they create certain kinds of measurements, certain kinds of experiences, and not others. And so this is also, I think, a point of tuning into what some sensing entities allow us to understand, but also what is not necessarily always included, so that we're asking those questions of what our attention is oriented to and how it might be expanded. I think this is why I like to use the term expanded as much as tuning, is to think about how to really trouble these devices and to make them work in ways that they're not necessarily organized to. So here's where citizen data, we work with participants to collect data, and they have access to their data. People were really putting the data to work, downloading it in spreadsheets before we had created a tool for them to analyze their data. They were calling up regulators, in the Pennsylvania example, state and federal regulators, and asking that all sorts of different things the sensors were not sensing be taken account of because of the data the sensors were showing. So when there were pollution events, they were asking that certain industry operations be looked at, that follow-up monitoring be undertaken, and so on. So I think the other thing about sensing, to get to this point of it not being passive, is it can really spark all kinds of different encounters. And we found we really couldn't predict what was going to happen when we organized these community monitoring networks and people started to work with their data, what they would do with it.
I live in southwestern Pennsylvania, and pretty much every morning we wake up, walk outside, and something smells strange. And so it's much the same, and it would be very useful to make better use of the data that's around. There are smaller activities here afoot. I'd like to also turn to some of our questions. We have a question from Jose Sanchez, who says, how can we resist the appropriation of data that has been generated through citizen participation by private entities that aim to extract value from such initiatives?
It's quite funny because I was asked this question quite recently in another event on data. And I think this is a real concern in terms of how citizen data can be used in lots of different ways. I mean, it would be interesting to know what examples are being thought of here with this question, but this is where we were thinking quite carefully about our data collection as not being overly zealous. So we collected very particular kinds of data, particulate matter levels. We did not collect location data through digital means. We actually had quite dumb location data that we made fuzzy. So with the Northeastern Pennsylvania example, we had township level data. We did that quite deliberately because, as probably most people know, Pennsylvania has had quite a lot of social tension in relation to fracking, and this continues still today. It's a flashpoint in the presidential election, in fact, but this was in 2013-14 when we first started the project, and it took place for several years, and communities were really at each other's throats in many ways, and data was the way in which they felt they could come to a collective agreement about whether and where pollution was occurring. So communities really felt data was important for potentially addressing some of the rifts in the community. But at the same time, people didn't want the data to be overly disclosing of them. So we had a very limited amount of data collection that we did. I think this is very different from what private companies do when they often are amassing large data sets. Also, we thought quite carefully about how the data could be used for different purposes. And in fact, the data has not been appropriated by private entities. If anything, industry has been quite annoyed with the citizen data because we did show that we were able to attribute pollution to fracking infrastructure through bringing in wind and weather data, through scraping some data online. And they were quite annoyed by this. This was not data they wanted to appropriate. But what did happen was that federal regulators, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, the ATSDR out of the EPA, did follow-up monitoring that corroborated the citizen data results. And so they then made a set of recommendations to the state level Department of Environmental Protection, who then expanded their air quality monitoring network. So we haven't had encounters with private entities appropriating the data, I think in part because of the way we've designed our data collection to really be as streamlined and specific as possible, not to over-collect. And this is something that is a kind of principle within the European GDPR as well. Yeah. We were doing this before GDPR, but I think it's an important thing to consider if you're a designer working with data. How can you ensure that you're not going to be disclosing more than you need to disclose? How can you really work with participants to ensure that they have control of that data? And of course, people could ask for their data to be removed. But in Southeast London, to finish very quickly, we did think about this because estate agents are starting to use air pollution data in relation to property information. And there has been some questioning of whether this will then affect property prices. So there could be environmental justice issues that arise depending on where the pollution is occurring, where the data is collected, and what pollution levels are shown. So I think this isn't a kind of get out of the whole situation, sort of just by having a streamlined data collection, but I think there are ways to think about data design that can potentially address that.
And also I'd suggest, to that end, the keynote this evening with Ruha Benjamin, Ori Talpern, and David Benjamin will get to questions around data and algorithmic bias and some different concerns for data collection and its outcomes.
Absolutely. And I think Ruha Benjamin's work on the Citizen app is a really key example of how what people are being asked to contribute and collect is a much different kind of data, a kind of citizen surveillance and reporting on your neighbor. So I think this is also part of the ethos of these projects that generates a much different kind of citizen.
Yep. Interesting set of things we have in play here, just to reflect on kicking off ACADIA, that we're talking about ecology and maybe shifting how we typically think of ecologies. And we're talking about computation and the role in that shifting. We're talking about ethics as something more practical at hand, and how to then lofty. And then it comes down to, in part at least, a conversation about data and how that data will play out. And I think more globally, the role of architecture in that question. There are a couple more questions I want to be sure that we get to, and it looks like we've got some time. I'd like to ask Rebecca Smith's question, who says, Jennifer, it sounds like you are suggesting that the reproduction of social/political inequalities might even arise quite explicitly from an emphasis on linear action rather than open-ended making, that the action model projects knowledge, whereas the making approach allows for other forms of agency to enter into the production of knowledge itself. You mentioned Haraway and Stingers. I'm also thinking of Daniela Rossner's critical fabulations. Are there other frameworks you turn to in this area, or maybe could you speak more to this point?
Yes, I mean, I think this is really an interesting point, because it's not as though it's attempting to create a binary to say that potentially more linear ways of working to be effective are less viable, but it's to say that often there will be a script for action. And these are, you can think of these as technological scripts, socio-political scripts, and that a certain kind of outcome is anticipated. And here's where I think really doing a kind of practice-based project, doing practice-based research really demonstrates how it's necessary to think about the ways in which those are much more porous practices and encounters. So, this is where the open-ended comes in, not as a kind of binary in relation to the linear, but it's really drawing on the pragmatist. So I think this is the underlying sort of thread here with James and Dewey, but also there's a fair number of Black pragmatists, Black studies pragmatists writing, like Cornel West in the early days and Eddie Glaude, who have really written about the way in which social change unfolds through engagement and iteration and being open to certain kinds of change that might not have been anticipated in an initial program. And I think this is where this really allows for ways of attempting to avoid dogma, of making sure that engagements are things that can allow a plurality of contributions. And of course, William James is the one who wrote A Pluralistic Universe, which has then been turned into the pluriverse phrase that's being used far and wide, I guess, including by Escobar, who's written a book on design and the pluriverse. So this is really what that is meant to summon into operation, less as a kind of binary to say one is bad and the other is good. And I also have to sort of draw on James for that, because he wrestles with this discussion in his writings. And, the point is not to displace one entirely, but it's to say that when we're doing work in the world, when we're putting ideas to the test, when we're working in a practice-based modality, more often than not, things will have to shapeshift, change, adapt, respond to circumstances. And this is really the kind of condition of democratic engagement rather than dogma. So that's the point there. And I think, yes, you've raised critical fabulations, Daniela Rosner's work, informed, of course, by Donna Haraway as well, and a much longer tradition of feminist technoscience. And I'm also very informed by this broader area of inquiry. And I think this is a really great resource to bring to something like ACADIA, because feminist technoscience is always asking, how are technologies made? Who gets to be recognized as the kind of author of those devices, as the entity that really is in a way in charge of those scripts and the power in relation to them, and who also recedes from view. So the modest witness, which is Haraway's critique of, in a way, the Chapin and Schaffer discussion of the modest witness, says, well, so many people are no longer able to be a modest witness. The scientist gets to be the modest witness, but women are no longer allowed to be part of this arena. People of color are not allowed to be part of this arena of who works on technology. Also technicians, the very people who make devices run. So there's a real class component to this. It's the kind of white gentleman in his salon, writing about the air pump back in the day, in the kind of rise of science and a certain way of knowing, who gets to be the modest witness, who gets to be the one who is the authority, but also isn't jamming the signal of objectivity. So I think this is where, feminist technoscience has a lot to offer in terms of really opening up practice to an expanded range of actors and contributions that look at the kind of inequalities that have shaped who does and does not get to register in those spaces, and also opens it to more than human contributors, which is also a kind of key component of feminist technoscience. These are not just human actors, there's all sorts of more than human actors who are part of this mix.
We could pull in also Cassandra Fraser's question here. I think it gets to some of that technologist-technician split. She said, Jennifer, when you were talking about your complex obstacles and troubleshooting with the egg sensor, this presented a red flag for me in terms of inequality, because not everyone has the same coding and technological knowledge. What do you think about this? Are there ways that these forms of knowledge, where did it go? There, I'm sorry, it moved up on me. Are there ways that these forms of knowledge can and should be made more accessible to all in order for more citizens to be able to participate in collecting this data?
Yes, I completely agree with this. And I do write about this in the longer version. And we've also written about this in a separate article in New Media and Society on recalibration. And we talk about the kind of dilemmas that are thrown up when these kinds of maker communities are often composed of very particular kinds of actors. And other scholars in science and technology studies have written about this in relation to hacker spaces and so on. And that often people engaged in environmental justice and social organizing projects, they really don't want to bother with assembling sensors from scratch. They would much rather work with devices that are plug and play. So this is something that we've written about in this recalibration piece in New Media and Society, to say that the way in which politics and engagement is organized in a makerly space is often one particular kind of configuration that is about getting devices up and running. But communities have a different notion of what it means to get devices up and running. So that's the way that I would, in the first instance, address that, which is that not everyone should have to or is interested in necessarily assembling sensors from scratch. This is the trajectory that we took to try to understand the claims that were being made for citizen sensing devices, to really work in a kind of critical way to think about, well, what is being operationalized when people assemble their own sensors? Are they necessarily becoming enlightened citizens and addressing the problem of air pollution? And what we found is that's far from the case. In fact, often those makerly discussions remain within a very particular milieu, and people who are more interested to address air pollution are working in different modalities altogether. And there are now sensors that are quite good at plug and play sort of functionality, like the purple air that I showed early on. My complaint with that device is you don't really have access to your data. So I think this then gets back to another component of the question, which is who has access? And here's where I think, we have tried to also incorporate a component of pedagogy as part of our public engagement. So we've held data workshops, we've composed data stories also to present the citizen data in ways that attempt to work with narrative, so not just measurement in the usual sense. And we've held workshops as part of those also to discuss the findings with participants and to compose action points. So I think there's all kinds of different ways in which we could think about this troubleshooting as not just centering on a device, but as a kind of larger problem, in this case of air pollution, and how people can make contributions to that. So it could be that they're contributing to the narratives for a data story, that they're proposing actions, that then they're even using that data, as with our Southeast London example, to obtain funding to run transportation pilot experiments to remake the urban fabric. So this kind of very much became citizen data, moving into citizen design in a way. And I think this doesn't have to just be people monkeying with, sort of wires and sensors. There's all kinds of ways in which they can contribute.
I want to take on a few more questions. There's so many good questions here. So just one question from Zhihao Zhang, excuse me. Jennifer and Molly, this provisional view, making and remaking, tuning and attuning, iterative and recursive engagement can be understood through the notion of prototyping. And prototypes have been attributed a key role in architectural and landscape design lately. I wonder if you have something to say about the idea of prototype or prototyping.
Maybe you should take the first step. I've been talking on so much, and that was
yeah, well, I mean, I think also that extends a question about what I think, looking broadly about the status of architectural design today versus, say, 10 or 15 years ago, where notions of prototyping, at-hand making, and workflow become the purview of an architect or a designer versus the kind of table-based, software-based methods of yesterday, I think. So I guess from my perspective, I'm a design professor with a PhD in architecture and find myself between these worlds. And I used to teach where the Arduino was invented. So prototyping is very much a way of being. I guess I'd be curious the extent to which, for the conversation here, we see prototyping as heuristic or at hand or practical, that maybe new kinds of knowledge are made through the ways that we're sensing the environment and acting upon, or I don't want to say acting upon it, but deriving new forms of knowledge that allow people to act in different kinds of ways. And that notion of prototyping, if we take it back to look at Jennifer's work, I think gives us something at hand to do. And at hand in the ways that we make knowledge and that we can work as citizens. Do you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I think that's great. I would just also perhaps add that the prototype is perhaps not as open-ended because it does work toward, as you mentioned, a certain kind of workflow, even in its kind of iterative way. I guess I would ask, is the prototype something that can completely change through community contributions? So is there a way to think about prototyping as something that can expand beyond the kind of designer workflow and contribution to become, and I know other people have written about this, but urban prototyping. People have written about urban prototyping and so on. But does this assume that there is a move to a certain kind of finished form despite the iterating? That's something I would want to look more closely at. It's a kind of interesting question.
There are so many good questions that we're not going to get to, but I'd like to at least share a couple of things. Jordan Nelson Long says, as a progressive theologian, I appreciate the framing of Black pragmatism as part of an ethical framework, and it helps me situate your statement about ethics being iterative within the making sensing interpretive process. Nevertheless, we must also grapple with ethics in the first place, in the moments before we embark on project work. This too is where damage is done. I'm curious about what frameworks might allow our projects, particularly those led by white folks and in partnership with industry, to engage in meaningful ethical reflection ahead of initial action in addition. And then to add to that, there is a question from Shane Berger about how we might more broadly consider this in our opportunities as a professional or even a political body of architects and designers and computational people.
Yes, I mean, I think that's a really great and important question. And here's where I think, I've always had a problem with frameworks to begin with. And we really wrestled with this problem when we were doing our first case study in Pennsylvania. We had this research design, which was to look at how sensors are being used by citizens. But we didn't have a kind of objective in terms of how the data would be used. And this is where I think also with this very open-ended process, we began having conversations with these community groups who are already doing their own monitoring. And they all had different agendas. They were not in agreement about how best to address this. Some of them were really sort of thought that fracking should be shut down entirely. Others wanted to work with industry because they were receiving royalties and so on. So we really entered this not from a fixed and settled initial condition of saying, well, here's our ethical framework, let's now go out in the world. But rather, I would say it was something that rushed at us from all sides. And we then had to work within these conditions as a way of trying to create a collective project of monitoring air quality and trying to do something with that data. So I wonder if there's something there about how ethics, and again, this is pragmatism, but it doesn't necessarily start as a framework that is then disseminated in that way, but rather is something that requires engagement and encounter and collective deliberation to even begin to form and tune what those engagements might consist of. And I think this is here then really raises lots of different questions about what are the terms of those engagements. These are kind of questions I'm also posing back to some of this work, because it does almost seem to require certain forms of deliberation and engagement that could seem to be privileging others and some and not others. And I think this is, obviously critique that's been raised in relation to various forms of democratic engagement. How can there be a plurality of engagements and ways of registering political encounters? This is something I'm really wrestling with in a new book I'm writing called Citizens of Worlds. So how can we think about citizenship not in the singular, but as something that is really tied to ontological plurality and is inevitably going to be a site of struggle? So this is, I think, something that really needs to be addressed in many different forms of design practice, where there might be an initial script, but it will give rise to these plural ontologies. So I think here's where there isn't just one initial framework. There's all sorts of different approaches, citizens of worlds, that come to these practices. And that's where I think practice really becomes the way in which they meet and have to work through these different struggles. And that's where also inequality really starts to become evident and also potentially can be addressed.
So thank you for that. I can't wait to see the new book. Do you know when it might be seen in the world? That's $1 million question.
No, I know. I've been working on it forever, but there keep being these interruptions. I've had many kind of major interruptions, not only COVID. So yes, it's sitting here with scribbled pencil marks as a complete manuscript, but
Fantastic.
it needs to be reworked. And, you know, sort of one of those things you write it and then you think, oh, but then there's this problem and there's that problem. So exactly this
Matter of an election.
that, yes.
Well, I want to point out that today we've had a really wonderful and wide-ranging conversation that changes how we think of what a how-to is, what the environment is, what ecology is, and where we interact with it, what possibilities open to us as citizens. And as you write, the more the knowledge that doing produces involves the very relations and networks that make worlds. And these are political inquiries and inhabitations. Coming up on the US election, coming up on Biden mentioning fracking at every turn, and coming up on the sets of things we're going to be talking about this week. I can think of no better way to have kicked things off. Jennifer Gabrys, thank you very much. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Molly and everyone.
Thank you, Jennifer and Molly both, for such an amazing opening keynote. I just want to echo Molly's comments. I'm so grateful for both of your thoughtful perspectives on these entanglements of technology, ecology, and ethics. And I really, I think we couldn't have imagined a better setup for the conference this week, and especially for the next keynote conversation this afternoon with Ruha Benjamin, Oreid Halpern, and David Benjamin at 4:15 Eastern. I thank you both again. It's so great to have you here to kick off the ACADIA 2020 conference. So that concludes this session, and I invite everyone to join us at the next event, Paper Session 1. If I just pull this screen up. There we go. Here's the kind of look ahead schedule. So Paper Session 1, Biological Interactions and Ecological Adaptation, which begins at 11:45 a.m. Eastern time, so in about 15 minutes. You should be able to find the Zoom webinar link on the conference website. Also, just a few quick notes for our attendees. We know that some of you had some issues accessing the conference platform this morning, but trust you were able to make it in. Rest assured that all sessions will be recorded and available to you until November 30th, so you'll be able to catch up on anything you missed. It takes about a day for us to process the recording, so look for them later this week on the conference website. This event in particular is already on our YouTube page, so you can watch it there. On our website, you can search by event, and the recording will appear in that event's entry. I also want to, just a technical note, encourage everyone to access the conference via their desktop browser. The platform does work on mobile devices, but it was designed primarily for desktop browsers, and this is the best way to make the link with the Zoom webinars. So I hope you join us for the next event at 11:45. In the meantime, please feel free to stop into one of the Murmur chat rooms, which you'll also find on the conference website. And Jennifer and Molly, you are more than welcome to join in if you want to continue the conversation. It's a kind of informal chat setup. With that, I thank you again for being here. And this concludes our first keynote. So we'll see you at the next event. Thank you, everybody.